So today we're going to be doing a workshop on designing a public portal for participatory environmental governance. And I don't know if you've heard of the concept of spiral learning, but it's basically where you learn something once and then it comes back around and you kind of learn it again better the second time, even if you didn't really get it the first time. This presentation might be a little bit like that. There will be a lot of details that I mention and go into a bit later. And I see folks showing up still, which is great. Please go ahead and add yourself in the document. I'm just starting on the intros here. So today we'll be doing a session on designing a public portal. And what I'm anticipating is that this is going to be a challenge for everyone. So I hope you're ready for it. And I'm going to tell you in advance too that there's going to be a number of sessions where I have you break out and take notes, and I'll be fairly clear about that. And I'm going to warn you in advance that a lot of times when you do breakout sessions in a webinar or a workshop, it's then you come back and you share them all together. That's not necessarily going to happen here. There's going to be a lot of sessions where you have breakouts and you take fairly detailed notes, and then you never talk about them here, but we will use those notes, over the next couple of years of our design work. So just forewarning on that. So I'll give you a bit more information about what we're working on, but first, this is your usual reminder that this is a part of the ESIP meeting and therefore adheres to the community participation guidelines. And I think if Megan, or someone, if you could drop the community participation guidelines in the chat, that'd be super helpful. But basically it talks about how to be a good member of a community. And I'm with EDGI, and we also have very strong adherence to a code of conduct and community participation guidelines. And one of the things that I'll encourage you to do is, even if you don't think that something was like a full code of conduct violation and you need somebody to get kicked out or punishment to happen or something, if something just happens and you feel kind of weird about it, or like maybe that would have made somebody uncomfortable, even if it's not you, I encourage you to still use the issue reporting process so that you can try that process, so that you can kind of talk it through with people, and so that we can all learn and grow as a community, because we really do want to be a very inclusive place, both EDGI and ESIP. So thanks for being here. And I'll give you the main goals of this session. What we're going to do is introduce the Environmental Enforcement Watch concept, which you might have seen in Megan's presentation at Funding Friday this morning. You might have also seen a little bit of it in the plenary on Monday. Then you're going to try a couple of tools that are very much prototypes. And I'll talk to you more about what they are and introduce them better later. And then you're going to try identifying some user challenges, and it'll be a bit of an empathy exercise. I told you already this is going to be hard. What you're going to try to do is some things that a lot of people in the real world are trying to do in terms of understanding how like environmental regulation is affecting their lives, their places that they care about, their people that they care about. And what you're going to find immediately is that it's really hard and you might not succeed. So putting that all out up front. That said, I'll give you my little slide introduction to what the Environmental Enforcement Watch is. One sec, I'll figure out the tech. All right, so this is the Environmental Enforcement Watch. We are a project of the Environmental Data and Governance Initiative, or EDGI. The Environmental Enforcement Watch, we also call it EW. So we're kind of acronym heavy already. But the Environmental Data and Governance Initiative is a project that spun up out of a fear in the wake of the Trump election, a fear that there would be information removed from public access under an administration that was hostile to climate science. And this was a fear based on some of the things that happened under the Canadian government. And so we have a lot of Canadian members. And then there's also proof that has borne out through EDGI's work over the last several years, showing changes to websites and changes to the way that the EPA policy works. What I'm going to show you today is one of our projects, the Environmental Enforcement Watch, which is fairly data focused and fairly environmental justice focused. But EDGI as a whole is a much bigger thing, and it just looks at federal accountability to environmental governance. And so we have a bunch of different branches, a bunch of different working groups. From people who look at scrapes of websites over time and analyze how it changes, what it means for the government to present information through an unregulated, unarchived format, such as a website. And they've produced some very interesting reporting, including like the removal of the term climate change from a number of websites under the Trump administration. And we have another group that looks at policy as it comes out and makes comment on it from a historical perspective. We have another group that talks to people within the EPA and talks about what's going on in terms of what is the vibe that's going around. Like, what are the unspoken things that are being expected within the realm? And we have some people who have spoken with us anonymously in that context, especially under early Trump, but we still have communication going on with members of the EPA. So this is an attempt to be a fairly holistic picture, a fairly multidisciplinary picture of what does it look like to try to do environmental governance in the United States, and how can we do it better? And the Environmental Enforcement Watch in particular looks at how we can do better justice through environmental data. I talked a little bit already about the motivation of this, but the Environmental Enforcement Watch started basically January of last year. We had a report a while ago called The Sheep in the Closet that was us showing to ourselves, proving through a look at the environmental data sets from the EPA, that violations of environmental law are chronic and routine. Enforcement hasn't been good for a very long time, and it got worse under the Trump administration. But it's not just the Trump administration, it's a much longer line. The whole line is pretty downward trending on enforcement, which means that what's working isn't, or what's being enacted as environmental governance federally isn't really working the way that it is designed to. We also did, one of our first EU projects was looking at enforcement before COVID-19 and after. And there was a policy that was brought out that said, okay, you don't have to report because of the challenges. And a lot of folks use that as a means to not report at all. So there's a big gap in data, and there's a number of gaps in data that you'll probably notice today. And so what we would like to do with the Environmental Enforcement Watch is notice those issues, call attention to them both to the public and to the EPA, and also do that in collaboration with groups that are more on the ground, and ask for changes, and hopefully work with members of the EPA and others to come up with a better vision for how we can do this. There is already a website that shows enforcement and compliance history, the EPA's enforcement and compliance history online, but there are some challenges. The UI is kind of confusing. It only lets you see stuff for the last 3 to 5 years. There's a lot of different downloads that are separate from that. And that's one of the things that we did, is we took downloads that go back more like 20 or more years and stitched them together to get a more complete interface than is shown on the website itself. But then there's also sort of more root issues, like this is data that's coming from facilities that are self-reporting. And they're not necessarily even saying whether it's an estimate or whether it's real data that was measured. And even just orienting it around facilities at all means that you're not really orienting it around communities or health outcomes or other goals that you might have. And all of that tied together, in addition to this can get pretty scientific pretty quickly in terms of like, okay, well, we know that this chemical was released in this quantity, but we don't know what that means in terms of, am I going to get sick? And so that's what the basis of EU is to say, okay, well, what can we do by working with the public? We have a lot of open hours and other workshop types and outreach. We have recently had a webinar working with folks who mostly were working with Latinx communities speaking Spanish. We've also reached out to folks in like Senator Markey's office to talk about climate change. We've talked to people in the Buffalo, Niagara area about their water keeping efforts. And what we want is to create a space where people can share their stories about lived experience, about the work that they've done on the ground. A lot of citizen scientists show up as well. And they talk to us about what fights they're fighting and what concerns they're having. And we try to help them by creating data tools that they can work with. And you are going to get a taste of those as well today. So let's get into it, actually. I'll give you a very brief demo here of one of the notebooks that we use, and you might recognize Jupyter notebooks, but even if you don't, that's great because most of the people we're working with have never used one of these either. So this is typically what we'll do when we reach out to a community is we'll give a brief presentation of like what sort of project this is and listen to them a bit about what they're trying to work on. And then we'll show them one of these. And I'm going to have you do breakouts in a minute to try these yourselves. But just to give you a really brief overview, there's like instructions here how to run, but I'll just show you. And basically what you're going to see is these different cells. And don't worry about overwriting anything. This is, if you wanted to save it, you have to save it yourself. Otherwise, it'll just auto-generate itself. So there's, when you hit play, it's going to tell you that it's not authored by Google, which we know because we wrote it. And you can hit play on every one of these cells by hovering over it and hitting it. And you're going to see it running code, and it'll pop up these different things. So let's say zip code. And I know that this is kind of confusing to just watch, so you'll get to try it, but I'm going to go through it very quickly. I'm going to do it for my home area. And I'm hoping that watching is helping you. And notice that I'm not hitting, like I'm typing in my zip code and I don't hit enter, because the way that this works is it's actually going to be code that's called in a later cell. And so right away, I've given it just a little bit of information, and it's able to turn up some graphs and say, okay, well, here are Clean Water Act facilities with the most non-compliant quarters in the zip code that I entered. So we have graphs. There's a lot more information that I'm going to pass over that you're welcome to look at later. You can choose whether you want to look at the RCRA is mostly hazardous waste type stuff. There's Clean Air Act, there's Clean Water Act, Safe Drinking Water Act. If we pick one, we can go and look at, it'll pull up a lot of data. I'll probably skip over this because it's more data than I can deal with, but I'd rather see it on a map, which is what this one's going to do. So this is showing me facilities with Clean Water Act violations in the last, I don't remember what the time frame is. But that's just your very brief overview. There's a lot more. You can save data through this. You can look at specific facilities. That's a ton of information to dump at you. So I'm going to stop sharing and give you a minute. Two thoughts. One that I forgot to mention is that my colleagues Megan and Steve are here as well, and they have done a ton of work on this. And at any point, they or I would be happy to answer. Are there any questions so far about just about specifically like what is edgy, what is this project? I think I missed something. We are going to come back around to a lot of the details, but any like I'm super lost type questions? Excellent. You're either so lost you can't ask, or we're doing great. So I'm going to give you an opportunity to break into smaller groups here and do some of your exploring on your own with that notebook that I just showed you. And what's going to happen is you're going to be broken into groups of size of 3 or 4 people. And I'm going to recommend that one of you is the screen sharer and operator, and the rest of you just kind of watch and follow along. Oh, Cindy also already shared that notebook, so thank you, Cindy. Megan and Steve and I are going to hop between rooms to make sure that you're seeing it. And the objective of this small breakout is really just to get familiar with the tool. This isn't like this isn't the part we're looking for feedback on. So it's just try it out, see if it kind of works for you, and if it doesn't, ask technical questions. Does that sound pretty doable?
And this is 10 minutes, Kelsey?
Yes, thank you. That's 10 minutes, and it's 10:44 my time, so coming back at 54 past the hour.
All right, ready to go.
And one, sort of cookie secret feature is that if you just held on to that link to that notebook, you could query that SQL database yourself. So if you have a use for it, feel free to mess around in the notebooks. Welcome back, everyone. So I hope you enjoyed your whirlwind tour of a notebook. It looked like most of you had at least some success. I know there were some people who hit bugs, and I probably should have warned you. That's probably going to happen today. It's not unusual to find something that's sort of an edge case where there's not the right amount of data and we don't yet have the right catch statement. So I know a lot of you were able to work through that, and we'll just add it to the list of things that are frustrating about doing this kind of work. But thank you for moving through that. Our next bit is going to be a very quick demo of the portal that we're working on. I think I forgot to mention that we have ESIP lab funding at the moment. And what our project is that we're working on is a web portal so that people can start to explore this stuff more on their own. Normally, we introduce this stuff in events and really guide people through it in a much more structured way than I just did with you all. And what we're hoping to do is make at least the reports and possibly more interactivity visible to folks as they need the data, right? So they don't have to rely on us responding to an email and then saying, oh yeah, we'll modify that notebook for you and then you can do it. We really want people to be able to self-serve a little bit more because we shouldn't really be the gates on this. Anyway, I'm going to very briefly introduce you to one more tool that Megan and Steve have been working on, especially Megan, I believe. And this is even more incomplete than the other thing, so be prepared for that. What we have here is a Shiny app that is exposing some reports that we've made in the past. And you will see that there are multiple tabs. Please ignore them. They don't work other than home. And there's this map that shows you geographically some places that we have reports for. And these reports are generated from the process of using that Jupyter notebook, but it took it a few steps beyond that in ways that we haven't yet been able to expose. I'm going to recommend, in order to use the map, that you uncheck things that don't say with reports after them. So remove all states and all congressional reports if you're following along at home. And again, you're going to have breakout rooms that are much longer to do an actual problem. So I'll hop between and you'll have debug time there as well. But this is just demoing. So you can look here and see that there exists a report for, here's Oklahoma #2. Which is a congressional district. You can also look at by state. And I'm going to use this to find OKO2. And it says, yes, there's a report. And you can click on it and see the report. And there is quite a large amount of information here. Some of it is contextual. Some of it is with respect to the entire United States. Some of it is breakdowns of different stuff. Identification of facilities like you already saw in the notebook, information about whose legislative district this is and the relevant committee that they're on, because we were collaborating with Sunrise a bit to make these, and Sunrise Movement works on, they do a lot of sit-ins in offices. So this is sort of what you can access through that site. This is again a very brief introduction to what is going to be a much bigger story. So with that, I'm going to go directly into the biggest challenge you get today, hopefully, the biggest challenge of this workshop, which is the user stories section. So what's going to happen is I'm going to break you out. Yes, please.
Sorry, before you go on, what does the shading in this Earth map mean? The congressional districts with reports. I'm looking at the Shiny app on another screen and I've selected states with reports and congressional districts. And there are some that are darker orange than others. What does that mean?
Thank you for that question. So if you just look at congressional districts with reports, or if you just look at states with reports, you'll get the one shade, but if they're overlapping, you'll get the darker shade.
Okay, got it.
And so what this is really just showing you is that we don't have reports for everywhere yet. And that is something that we're looking into. But these were fairly manually generated. So the number of them is actually quite high for the amount of work, even though it looks fairly sparse on a map. Thanks for asking, Kathy. So in your user stories breakout groups, it'll be similar size of groups. And I'm going to ask you to, and if you're following along in the Kiko, I have no idea how to pronounce that, chat document, on the top of page 3 or the middle of page 3, there's this section called user stories. And I'm going to ask that once you're in the breakout room, you find out what room number it is, and you take the user story that is related to it. So number 1 is you live on the Kenai Peninsula in Alaska, and you want to know which companies are putting chemicals in the water that might be dangerous for salmon so that you can talk to them about it. And these are realistic user stories, but they're not necessarily exactly real stories. And one of the reasons we're having you do this is, well, partly to experience it, but partly also because when we work with these groups, a lot of times it's people who are already overburdened, not just from environmental justice issues, but also because they're spending a ton of volunteer time trying to prove that environmental harms are being done in the areas that they care about. And so we want to ask them to do as little work as possible, but still get the result of their problems being solved. So you guys trying this is going to be immensely valuable because I'm going to ask you to do a couple of things. One is to describe what you do narratively. This is kind of a user test exercise where we say, okay, I want you to start with the map and the notebook that I already showed you. But I also want you to use your expertise and the entire internet, including Google search or DuckDuckGo or whatever you use, to try to answer the question as well as you can in the time provided. And so just, I'm going to ask you to have sort of 3 assigned roles within your group. One will be the screen sharer like you just did, so that you're all kind of looking at the same thing while you do the work. One of them will be the person who takes notes on what it is you're doing. So you say, okay, I went to this website, I looked at this section, this thing didn't work, so I tried this other thing. So that'll be really useful for us in just trying to understand how a group of people might process this problem. The second part is findings. So maybe you find out, okay, Kenai Peninsula is in this congressional district. How am I going to find out what chemicals are relevant to salmon health, and so on and so forth. And those start to be really interesting questions that we can actually bring back to, that we can actually take those findings back to our research and say, okay, maybe we can generate a more complete report on this. And then other notes is anything that you feel like we should know, like, hey, this was super hard, or have you heard of this similar project? So basically, you're going to get a half an hour to try to do that. And I think the other thing I need to tell you is crossing page 2 to page 3, I have this resources for this session. So I'm requesting that you start with the 2 resources I just showed you, but I also am recommending a few more resources. We've done congressional report cards that you can see on our website in this totally different visualization, where you can say, okay, well, I can click through here and get another one of those reports. You can also look at this democratizing data report, which looks at congressional districts. This is a comparative across the whole US, and it's a huge report that we put together. And then there's also a lot of, there's more stuff out here from the EPA. There's ECHO website itself. There's the My Waterway Explorer. We actually built another notebook about watersheds, which you can see here. It's similar in format, but different from the one you just looked at. Little Sis is a way to look at different government connections. There's human health on IRIS. And I'm encouraging, if you want to add stuff to this list that you think is in the same genre that would really help people, we might not know about it. So if you add it, that could be really helpful. And we're in a good position to distribute that resource to communities that might really use it. Do we have questions about this exercise? Okay, I think we're ready for more breakout groups. Thanks, everybody. You've been very willing.
Great, just a second. 30 minutes, Kelsey?
Yep. Yeah, coming back at 35 past the hour. I think that's all the little boxes that are going to pop up. Thank you everyone for jumping into that. I saw every single room. All of you are doing a lot of work on these, and it's really cool to see you get into that. I want to give you a little bit of space to decompress and reflect on that a little bit, because I know probably all of you have some form of feedback in the realm of like, this was super hard, or this was super scary, or super interesting. So what I'm going to do is actually pop you right back out into breakouts, but different ones, so that you can do reflection with people who had a slightly different experience than you in the same space. And yeah, I'm going to have you in, Megan, if we can do rooms of 5 this time, that will be, I think, a little bit easier for folks who want to choose their level of participation, and give me and Steve and Megan a little bit more room to hop around. So if you're following along in the notes doc, which I know you all are because you did amazing notes, thank you. On page 9, we now have 9 pages. There's breakout 3 reflection. And I've put in some prompt questions. And once again, and here, I'll share my screen so you can see what I'm talking about. So once again, please look for the room number once you go in a breakout room, and use whatever one corresponds to you and take notes. And please feel free to go off script, skip around in the questions, answer what you can, sort of in a group discussion format. And as usual, I'll be hopping between, and you're free to totally ignore me when I do. And I think, Megan, I think we want to give this one 10 minutes.
On it.
All right. Any questions about how to do it, folks? Thank you. So thank you so much. I heard a ton of excitement, frustration, ideas. Thank you so much for engaging so fully with this. It's been really amazing to get to lead you through this, what I would say is a very ambitious workshop style. And you all really came through with it and added notes. And I do want to say one more time that, like, I know we didn't get to talk about everything that you put in the notes as a group. And I really want to encourage you to, if there's things that you still are thinking of, keep adding to this notes document, because we definitely will refer to it as an U team later. And it's just immensely helpful. So thank you so much. And we're going to head into our closing circle with this workshop. And that looks like 2 different things. One is I'm going to kind of dump a bunch of information on, you know, what might happen next, how you might be involved. The second part, and I'm doing that up front so that I don't forget to do it, because the second part is probably the more interesting discussion of what do we want to do, what takeaways we want to share back to ESIP as a community. So here's the information dump part. And if you want to follow along in the notes, this is page, what is now 11, because you all added so much context here, so thank you. Page 11, closing circle. So we have a Twitter account if you want to like casually follow our project, at EnviroDGI. We also have at UNetwork. Yeah. And thanks to Steve and Megan were here and super helpful. And I know a lot of you interacted with them directly. So thank you for being here, both of you, and also for basically producing these materials. It's been a big team effort, and there's been a lot of people. Some other names that I should mention are Sarah Wiley from Northeastern and Eric Nost from University of Guelph, and Lourdes Vera, also from Northeastern, have worked on this a lot. And then there's just been a ton of other people from environmental justice communities, volunteers who've shown up just because they were interested in this project, students, etc. So this has been a hugely collaborative project, and we hope that it continues to be one. In fact, it couldn't possibly exist if it wasn't one, because it's a lot of work that needs a lot of input. That said, if any of you are interested in becoming more core to this project, you're absolutely welcome. I know probably most of you don't need another commitment, but I'll just put the invite out in case you want it, which is we meet every Tuesday at 11 my time, which is Pacific. And I put the link to the meeting, and you can just show up. You're welcome. Or if you want to get more involved with EDGI generally, I mentioned at the beginning, it's not just the EU project, it's also all these other different areas of environmental governance examined from a lot of different interdisciplinary lenses. So please feel free to reach out to me. My email address is also here. And I wanted to also suggest, if anybody has an ESIP cluster that says, oh man, I wish we got to do this project or do something similar to this, I would be happy to come to one of your cluster meetings and lead an exercise like this. So do let me know if that would be interesting to you, because I would love to get more perspective, and the ESIP community is absolutely phenomenal for this. Maybe
Yes,
Steve, did I miss
community
anything
data.
I should say?
Come to community data.
Yeah, all right. Anything else I should announce before we go into the takeaways discussion? Anything, Steve? We got it. And as you know, this is very prototypey, and we're going to keep working on this. This is what 1.5 years of work, starting from the what if we looked at the echo database question. Like this is how far we've come, and it's really not been that long yet. So I think this could go a lot further. And its direction is very much dependent on who shows up. With that, let's go into kind of the one big group discussion we're going to have, which is we want to capture some takeaways and shared insights for the ESIP community. And the questions are, what did we discover? How can we help each other? And what knowledge and resources do we have to share? Would anyone like to nominate kind of a top level takeaway?
This is a great resource that is really going to benefit from a lot of input from various players to make it truly usable for various impacted communities. But it is such a great thing to have it kind of being pulled all into one place. Steve made the comment that EPA is very stovepiped. And this is trying to break through those stovepipes. So I greatly appreciate that effort.
And I would say the frustrations that came up about, can we figure out more about actual environmental conditions where I live or a place that I'm interested in? There are a number of current tools that can help in that regard, and I could help EDGI identify candidates. But there's also kind of looking ahead, and Kelsey, I sent you that thing, that AGU video that I did, but this whole idea of environmental right to know and citizen science or volunteer science or whatever term we should use, and the all of the Internet of Things type initiatives that are going on right now, like Purple Air, for example. There's just so much activity that could be leveraged that could have really powerful impacts where people feel like they actually have real information about their air quality. What about my drinking water? How many more flints are we going to have? What can we do to help prevent those situations? What is that facility doing over there? So I think there's a lot of opportunity, and the technology is greatly expanding what is now possible. Because when the toxics release inventory was started back in the 80s, no one had internet except for a few academics and the Department of Defense, right? And the toxics release inventory reflected the severe limitations of the time. And now, over 35 years later, the capabilities are vast, and collectively we should be exploiting those.
Yeah, so I don't know, reflecting back on a couple things from this week, I guess I was struck a little bit by the tribute and whatnot that we had to Peter Fox the other night, and we got into a little bit of a discussion on systems versus frameworks, which a little bit devolved into a academic exercise, which was, okay. But, and then thinking about our community data cluster exercise the other day, where we were looking at data from Flint and running into like issues with accessing Michigan State data and Flint City data and whatnot. We need a framework that's going to allow us to take government data that is blessedly open and available to us in a lot of ways, and mobilize those data for analytical use and the addition of context by lots of people that need that information as something actionable in our lives. And it's not a trivial thing to do that. I mean, every one of these data sets that's out there is a little different, and they use different conventions. They've got, stuff that needs to be done just in terms of data cleaning and work. And it takes a lot to do that. And no one system is going to be able to handle that. Whether a human system or a technological system is going to be able to do all that. What we need is a framework, a way of thinking about doing that work, and a way of mobilizing the community of all of us to come together and do stuff within that framework that mobilizes those data and gets them online. And so you guys have a fantastic start to that with what you've done with Sunnybrook and bringing the EPA data together. And that needs more stuff. I mean, that's what your Funding Friday thing is about, right? So there's other data to bring together and questions about how do we do that. And I guess I would encourage all of us to be thinking, and maybe challenge all of us to be thinking about, how do we stub into that framework? How do we dedicate some time and find some time and resources, whether it's part of our jobs or just something of interest, to hook ourselves onto that framework and to be part of contributing code ultimately and knowledge about these data and how that can translate into context for how they're used in a way that really accelerates this, because we can't wait forever to have everybody just come along and do this. We really need to put some resources behind this and turn the investment that our agencies have been making and opening themselves up and being transparent into data that's actually mobilized for analytical use down at a citizen level. So I really applaud what you're doing. I think we're on a fantastic track, and we need to keep trucking with it.
Thanks, Greg. And thanks everybody. I want to take a note of the time. You're supposed to get a break now, so I want to cut us off on time. I really appreciate all your feedback, and we will absolutely read every note you put in that doc. So thank you so much for participating. This has been really wonderful.